It's great to be here today. I'm Cheryl Doss. I'm a professor of international development at Oxford and have been working on household surveys and working with household survey data for more years than I want to count. And I spend a lot of time trying to think about better ways to collect household survey data, and particularly to think about how to collect data on things that are really hard to measure. So things like women's empowerment and who's making the decisions and trying to understand some of those. Marya is now working with me as a postdoc, and one of the things that we're going to be doing is putting together a household survey. The plan is to field it in Ethiopia. We'll see what happens and whether things are stable enough for us to do it there, but to look at intra-household decision making. So we're looking to interview multiple people in the household to try to understand how decisions get made. I'm going to present this at a fairly high level today on household survey design and really try to highlight some of the issues and some of the things to really be thinking about. For many of them, then you'll want to go back and spend some more time really thinking about those particular details, but we can't really do all the details today. But just to really kind of flag what some of those big issues are that you might need to think about. So what is a survey? A survey is a systematic method for gathering information. And I think the key piece here is that it's systematic. And when we're collecting a survey, we want much of the information to be standardized, so that often if we're going and doing qualitative work, right, we have these very free-flowing conversations with people, and they go off in different directions, and that's part of what's really useful and interesting. But with a survey, you really want it to be much more standardized. So a whole range of things ought to be standardized. Your introduction, how you start out and tell them what you're doing, and the instructions to the respondent. The questions should all be the same for everybody. The answer options. So we're going to talk a little bit about pre-coding some of the options, the order of the questions, and then the basic way that the interviewer is behaving, and the context to the extent possible. Should all be as similar as possible for everybody that you're interviewing. And this isn't usually where we start when we're thinking about a survey, but I think it's really important before you start designing a survey or making any of those decisions that we're going to talk about is to go back and really think about what is the research question? What is it that what are the questions that you're trying to be able to answer with your survey questions, right? So there's the questions you're going to ask the respondents, and those you're going to analyze those in order to be able to answer a much bigger research question. So really thinking about what that is. And often it's really helpful to start out and think about how you're going to analyze the data. What are you going to run regressions? If you're going to run regressions, what variables do you want to have on the left-hand side? What variables do you want to have on the right-hand side? Right, and really to start thinking about that before you start thinking about any of the details of the questionnaire. And then to keep coming back to this, kind of every time you sit down to work on it, to look again and say, now, what am I trying to do? What is the big questions that I'm trying to answer with this? I can't tell you how many times I have had people come to me with their data already collected, trying to figure out how they're going to answer their question and realize they haven't asked the right things or asked them in the right way. So the first thing to think about is who you're going to interview. And we're talking about household surveys. So I'm going to assume that we're thinking about kind of interviewing households. But we don't actually interview households very often. We almost never in a survey sit everybody in the household down together and interview them all. So you have to think about who you're going to interview within the household. And there's now lots and lots of evidence that shows that who you interviews matters. You will get different answers to the same question depending on who in the household you ask. And there's lots of work, I've been quite involved in some of this, showing that men and women, for example, give systematically different answers on a number of kinds of questions. So issues about income, asset ownership, who makes decisions, all kinds of things that you might think of as being at the household level, actually you'll get different answers depending on who you ask. If you ask adult head of the household versus their adult child living in their household, you're going to get different answers. So thinking about who that is, what is the information you want, and who do you need to talk to be able to get it. So there's some things you can ask one person in the household, and this is how many household surveys are done. So you'll ask somebody about the household and you'll pick one person. It may be that you pick the head of the household. It may be that for some issues, instead of thinking about the head, you might think about the person who's the most knowledgeable. So there might be some domestic water issues that you think it's not the head, because we usually define the head as being the man. And he may not know, and we want to interview the person who's most likely to know, and that may be the woman. And there's a range of questions that you can ask at that level about the household. But for a number of kinds of questions, you really need to ask the individual. You need to pick the person you want an answer from and ask them about their own experiences. So if you want to know about somebody's knowledge, their preferences, their time use, or their income, among others, you need to ask them and not somebody else, right? And if you're not sure about that, think about what would happen in your household if somebody came and interviewed your spouse and asked them about how you spent your time and whether you knew how to do something. They'd get an answer, but whether it would be a good answer or not is, you can decide. So for some things, you have to ask that individual. So we have to think about how you're going to pick the individual within the household. Sometimes we really care about mothers of young children. And so that's quite easy. We pick the woman who is a mother of a young child in that house. Some kinds of questions, we might actually want to have some answers from men and some answers from women so that we can compare and see if men and women are having different experiences. We could interview a man and a woman in the same household, a husband and wife, or we could, in one household, interview a woman, and in one household, in the next household, interview a man, right? And then we can do gender comparisons as well. If you want to understand the relationships between husbands and wives and how they make decisions, then you need to interview both of them within the same household. So really thinking through who you're going to interview in a particular household is going to make a big difference in terms of the kinds of answers and what you can do with your analysis. I want to say a little bit about sampling. So again, this is part of who you're going to interview. I just talked about who within the household you're going to interview. And then this is thinking about which households are you going to interview? How do you pick which households? In a census, every single person or every household in the relevant population is interviewed or counted. So if we think about a national census, right, that's where every person in the country is counted. We're obviously not going to do that in any of these studies, but think about what the population that we're interested in is. We might be able to interview everybody in a small village and do a census of that village. You could do sometimes a census of a workplace or a community organization. So that's where you're really interviewing everybody in that particular population. Typically what we do is a sample survey where we pick a sample of those people and just interview some of them. And then we have to really think about the strategy of how we pick those people. And that if we want to be able to say anything beyond that, I interviewed 100 people in this area and they said this, and we want to think that it's representative of that group, we really need to think about the sampling strategy. How do we get a sample that's representative of a particular, the population that we're interested in? We need to think about what that is, what representative of what. Sometimes we try to make surveys that are representative of a particular geographic area. So we randomly sample people in a particular geographical area. But that question of what's the appropriate population that we're interested in for the research question that you're asking? So you got to go back, what's the research question and who's the appropriate population that we should be sampling? So some of my examples here are more ag than water because I mostly do agricultural household surveys. But we could think about that we could be interested in sampling from the population of all farmers or of all farmers who are using a particular technology or all farmers who are growing maize or all farmers who are near a particular road or within a distance of a market, right? And really defining what is that appropriate population that we're interested in that's going to help us to answer the research question. So other things could be, you could think about sampling from all the members of a water users association or sampling from among those who live in a village with a water users association. So you've got both people who are inside and outside of that. Again, depends on the kind of question that you're asking. So in trying to figure out your sample size, there's no really easy rules of thumb on this, and it's really useful to consult with somebody who can help you figure out how large of a sample you will need. And I think Marya and I had a nice chat about this. And I think every time either of us has been involved in designing a survey, we've pulled in somebody who can really help just kind of run those numbers and knows the right formulas and things to plug in. So I'd encourage you to find somebody to help you think about that a little bit. And every university's got people who do this and people in statistical departments who, if you give them the right information, they can do this in their sleep. But things to think about what's going to affect how many people you need to interview. One is, are you just trying to describe this group of people, this population? What are their characteristics? Or are you trying to test between two different groups and understand if there's differences between two groups, whether it's between men and women, or between members of the Water Users Association or non-members? If so, you're going to need a larger sample size. If you're looking at an impact and trying to do an impact evaluation and see if a project has had an impact, you're going to need probably a larger sample size and to try to detect that impact. And you'll need to be able to think about and tell your statistical person kind of how many people you think will be impacted. And is it going to be a big impact, easy to measure a big impact, or is the measure going to be kind of small? That's going to affect how many people you have to interview in order to be able to see that in your data. And then if you're trying to figure out if a project or something had a differential impact on different groups of people, you'll need even a larger sample to be able to make those inferences across groups. And obviously, the other factor that matters for all of this is the cost, and trying to balance the cost with making sure that your sample is big enough that you can actually answer the questions that you want. I think the worst thing to do is to go out and spend a bunch of money and time and effort to collect a survey that didn't interview enough people that you can tell any kind of a story from the results, right? So narrowing down your question, figuring out what you can do, and making sure that you can actually answer that question is the piece that it's the hardest part actually of trying to put together a survey. Trying to figure out how you're going to sample once you have an idea of how many. A couple of things, if there's already a listing of everybody, that's really easy. Then you can just randomly pick names, put all the names in a hat and randomly, or all the households, and draw them. Many of the places that we work, there is no list of everybody. And so you need another strategy, and there's all kinds of them. I mean, and the most common one is just using a rule like I'm going to walk through the village and interview people in every 4th house or every 6th house, or some way to randomly choose across. And the key piece is going to be, as you're thinking about how you're going to sample, to think about who you might be missing. Are you missing some people by the strategy that you're using, right? Are you missing people who are living just outside the village and might not be counted in this way? How do we make sure that the strategy for including them isn't missing the people that you really want to be interviewing? Okay, let me say a little bit about questionnaire design and some of the things that you need to be thinking about. First, I'm going to say this again. You really need the analysis plan before you design the questionnaire. What information do you need? Are you going to need to analyze? You need to know that before you start figuring out what questions you're going to ask. You think about the length of the interview, and you will have people tell you all kinds of things about the length of the interview, that it has, I have people swear that, you can't possibly ever interview people for more than half an hour, to people who have done surveys where they've come back several days in a row and interviewed people for many hours. Shorter tends to be better than longer in terms of getting responses and getting good quality responses. You're going to need to think carefully about how you order the questions, which things you're going to ask first and which things you're going to ask later. You want to start out with questions that will put people at ease, make them comfortable talking to you. You need to build that trust. So not asking hard, complicated questions first, or particularly personal questions first. So build up the trust and the rapport, but then also to be aware that respondents will get tired. And sometimes they'll just stop answering. Sometimes they'll stop paying attention and stop giving you good answers. So you also want to make sure that those important questions are early enough that you get real answers to them. One question on designing the questionnaire is often the easiest thing to do is to pre-code a number of answers, right? Easy one is on schooling. You might ask them if they finished primary school or secondary school, right? Have a set of kinds of answers where you're gonna tick the boxes. For schooling, it's pretty easy to think about. If you're asking people what their sources of water are, you want to make sure that your codes that you're going to look at and mark really match up with what people in that community are doing. And if there's really important nuances between a couple of them within that community, to be able to code those separately. So I think many of you are all working in these communities and know them pretty well before you start doing household surveys. You want to make sure that the kind of these pre-codes are appropriate and are getting the right amount of detail for the kind of analysis that you're going to do. And then you want to think a little bit as you're going through it about skip patterns. If you're going to ask somebody if they have piped water in their house, right? You may have a bunch of questions that you want to ask them if they say yes. But if they say no, then you want to be able to skip those kinds of questions. But spending some time in putting that questionnaire together so it's really clear which things they're gonna skip. I've seen people present results of surveys where they ask people, if they earned any income from something, and then even when the person said no, in presenting the data, they presented answers from all the people who said no, right? In which point I couldn't figure out how to interpret what they were doing. So thinking about these in advance is helpful. There's a few other things that it's always useful to collect. These aren't things you have to ask in the survey or in your questionnaire, assuming that you've got somebody doing the interviewing. But it's useful to have information on where the interview was held. You want to know who the enumerator is, who's asking the questions. Particularly, is it a man or a woman? Might be useful to know if it's a young person or an older person, if you've got enumerators who are both young and old, because sometimes we find that who the person asking the question is also affects the answer. And so we want to be able to just look and see if we're getting, or one enumerator just ask much more probing questions. So who was the enumerator? Who else was present? Are you interviewing the person alone, or are there 6 other people in the room answering as well? Sometimes that's fine, depending on the question, but sometimes it might not be. And you can't always control it, but you can at least keep track of who's there. And then the start and end time of the interview, in part because it's really helpful to know how long it was. And it may be also useful to know what time of day it was. Sometimes we find that you get really different answers if you're interviewing people in the morning rather than the evening. And in your analysis, then you can look at that. For pretesting, the main thing I would say is yes, pretest, pretest, pretest. You want to make sure that the questions that you're asking are what people are answering, that they understand them. If you're translating them, you want to translate them, right? Translate your questionnaire into whatever language, and then have somebody translate it back and see if it makes any sense. It's always fun because it doesn't always. So you want to pre-test it to make sure that people can understand the questions, they know what they mean. And we often do something that we call cognitive testing, where you pick just a couple people and go through the whole questionnaire with them, but then sit down with them and ask them how they understood the different questions, right? Get them to give you all the background of what they were thinking about as they were answering the questions. So you can figure out if it makes sense and if you're getting what you thought you were getting. I want to say just a tiny bit about phone surveys, and which is what I think a lot of people are doing at the moment. And just thinking about some of the additional things you have to think about. One is about the time of day that you're calling, about privacy issues. We often think that if you're calling somebody, that they're the only one hearing your voice. You know that other people might be around and hear what they have to say. Some colleagues of mine working in India found that many of the women that they were interviewing had to put their phones on speakerphone to be able to answer. It was the social norms and their household rules were that they could not talk to a stranger without putting it on speakerphone, so that, again, there's no privacy. Everybody knows what those questions are. That may be fine, but you want to make sure that it's fine. But there's more challenges with language, with interpretation, with bad connections when you're doing phone surveys, as we all know from conversations we have. I think there's people who are arguing now that shorter calls more often may work better. So rather than trying to have a long interview with somebody over the phone, to do several shorter calls, you also build trust. You're more likely to lose them though and not have them answer the phone or talk to you the third or fourth time. So there's a bit of a trade-off on that. And again, there may be costs to respondents. If you're calling them, if they have to pay for their phone and their airtime, put money on their phone to talk to you, then you've got to think about the ethical implications with that. And we also have to think about who we're missing with phone surveys, who doesn't have a phone, who doesn't have access to a phone. Again, much more likely still in many places to get men responding to phone surveys than being able to interview women with phone surveys. And I'm going to turn over to Marya for a couple minutes.
Thanks, Cheryl. So another thing to think about is the survey method approach. So you have the traditional pen and paper interviewing. You also have CAPI, or computer-assisted personal interviewing with a tablet. So what's nice about CAPI is it can really reduce a number of errors, or has the potential to reduce errors. So it will automatically follow skip patterns for the numerator, instead of the numerator having to flip through the survey, him or herself. It can remind the numerator to double check a response that's highly unlikely. It can detect missing entries and prevent possible or impossible entries. Also, what's nice about CAPI is the data can be uploaded day by day during the data collection. And so it's typically checked by the supervisors, but then also the research team can go back and look at it day by day, which allows you to follow along and see where there may be issues. And then it can automatically give you timestamps, so you know how long the interview is, as well as when it was conducted, and you have the option for a GPS location. Although this can depend on the tablet, right? The quality of the tablet. Sometimes we're not able to capture the GPS as well as we'd like. So the other thing that's really useful is that the interview time is often typically reduced with CAPI. And then you're skipping this whole, data entry step. So you can more quickly at the end dive into the research after data collection. On the other hand, there's some upfront costs, right? So there's the additional training of CAPI. There's the equipment that's needed, so the tablets themselves. You need Wi-Fi for each team, extra batteries, the bags, the equipment to protect the tablets. And it takes time to learn the software, as well as enter the survey into CAPI. Typically, when I've used CAPI, I'll have both the paper format as well as the computer format. And they can even be a bit different. So the module, for example, for the 24-hour time diary in a paper and pen type survey is going to be formatted very differently in CAPI. So one thing, if this is of interest, learning CAPI, the Asian Development Bank has sponsored free, massive, open online courses. And the next one will be starting mid-March. And it's an interactive module. And they basically teach two types of software. So the US Pro Android, developed by the US Census Bureau, and then also Survey Solutions, which is designed by the World Bank. So here you'll learn how to develop your own questionnaires, the management of the data collection, and just the basics in general. So moving on to thinking about the training, it's very important, even if you're not going to be the one that's that's overseeing the training. As the research investigator, it's really important that you're there at least as a point person, so that the trainers are able to ask you important questions around definitions and clarify terms. If you're leading the training yourself, so here's some things to think about. You'll need a number of materials. Here, I would say that some of the key components are the numerator's manual. So this is going to be very important. It's going to be the instructions to the numerators on the basic definitions, on informed consent. It will go through the questionnaire and provide examples as needed. And this will be what the numerator then can refer to after the training in the field. You'll have paper copies of the questionnaire. You're going to use CAPI, then you have tablets. You'll also need a separate manual for also the tablets then for the enumerators to take into the field. For the training, I found it really useful, especially if I was training CAPI, is to have a projector with the computer, so I could actually pull up the screen for the class on the projector. So some key components of training, of course, these can be moved around a bit. So typically when I've done my own field studies, I'll start out with the aim of the study, the description of the field test, and the objectives of the training. Present the agenda, and then provide all the kits. So the manual, the paper, the questionnaire, notebooks, pencils, tablets, equipment, and then dive into the discussion of the expectations. So what are the numerators' roles in the field? What are we hoping for? And then go through the definitions of the key concepts. So, for example, it varies by context, but a household may be defined in one way in one country, but in another way in another. Or what is the definition of a plot or a water source? So going through all the different key concepts. Who's the key informant? And then providing an overview of the questionnaire structure. So maybe the questionnaire is first a household level, and then an individual level questionnaire. And then a detailed review of each question and the pre-codes, as well as skip patterns. And this is where enumerators will likely bring up a number of questions. There may be some tweaks and small changes here to the questionnaire. It's really important to go through this, and it can take a bit of time. And then, of course, if you use CAPI, you need to spend some time training the numerators on the tablets and the software. I find simulation of the questionnaire and specific modules useful as a group, and then to really dive into these in teams. And here you might focus on what's read out loud and then what's not. And then some of the key considerations, informed consent, how do we ask for this, safety issues, ensuring privacy. Spend a day training then the supervisors, organize the teams for the field, and then do a simulation based off of different possible events. And what's really quite important is a pilot test. So typically this is meant doing going to a community, a nearby community, but not the same as the ones that you will be, that's part of your population, and actually doing it as if you're asking the questions, as if you're really going to do it as you would in the field. And we come back and debrief and discuss the pilot, some of the issues, address the different issues the following day, and then sometimes having to repeat. So in one country, we did have to repeat the pilot test a couple times to get this to be ready for the actual field test. So the length of the survey can really depend on the difficulty of the concepts and the experience of the enumerators, the length of the survey, and the tools used, right? So FAO recommends anywhere between 8 to 12 days for agricultural surveys. My experience in kind of smaller 2-hour field studies in Indonesia, Uganda, and Kenya was we tried about 2 weeks. And in Uganda, 2 weeks was perfect for a decision-making and time use survey. And it was structured a similar way as the Women's Empowerment Agricultural Index, where you have a household survey and then you interviewed multiple individuals privately and simultaneously. And then many of the enumerators were experienced and had already worked on these types of surveys. They understood the survey structure quite well, so this length of time worked well. In Indonesia, the survey was exactly the same, but 2 weeks wasn't enough. So many of the enumerators didn't have experience with this type of approach. And the pilot ended up needing to be redone a few times in order for it to feel comfortable to go into the field. So some other things to consider is you'll need additional time to train the trainers prior to the training if you're going in that direction, or if you're translating into local languages. So in Uganda, there's multiple local languages, and so there was time that was needed for the numerator groups to work together and to work through these different translations. Some things to keep in mind is that it's really useful to have activities that keep enumerators engaged. 2 weeks is a long time, so one thing I did was quizzes, like something fun. So you do short quizzes at the beginning or after lunch. It's also really difficult to do the training alone. So the best training I did was with 3 others from the same team, in addition to those at the Statistics Bureau. The Uganda field test survey, I did all the numerator training alone, and you end up doing so much work in modifying the surveys and going through and looking at what's working and what's not, that it's very useful to have others. It's a challenge on your own.
Great. Just as a last thing, we wanted just to say a little bit about the ethics of doing surveys and things to be thinking about. One is thinking about the risks and mitigating the risks for the enumerators. So thinking about where and when they conduct the interviews and making sure that they have the permissions so that the people doing the interviews are safe. Need to think about the risks to the interviewees, to the respondents, again, when and where the interviews are conducted, and thinking about whether any of the questions are on topics that may be seen as controversial, and particularly if they are, to make sure that the question that they're being interviewed in private so other people aren't hearing the answers. You want to think about whether the interview will be the interview itself, just the process of interviewing somebody could be seen as threatening to somebody. Is there somebody who's going to be unhappy that you're interviewing a particular person? Are the questions you're asking raising any traumatic issues for the respondent? And you might think, oh, we're asking questions about water, right? Water's not very traumatic. But if you're asking people questions about where they go to collect their water, right? Women are often deal with issues around sexual harassment as they go and collect water. And if you're asking any of those kinds of questions, really thinking about the impact you might be having on people who are answering them. And then you always need to think about how you're going to protect and anonymize the data. And then just as you're working in the communities, again, I know all of you are mostly going to be doing household surveys in places where you've been working, but thinking about whether you're raising issues that may be divisive in these surveys, just as the act of your asking these questions and going off and interviewing people with different opinions privately about this, is that going to increase tension within the community? And also useful to think about whether by asking the questions, are you changing attitudes or changing values? Are you asking people to think about things they've never thought about before. What is the impact of that going to be? That may be part of what you're trying to do, but just to be really clear about those before you start. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open for questions. Yeah, and I think thinking about the enumerators too, the piece we didn't mention is that if you're trying to interview both men and women, depending on where you are, you may need to have women interviewing women. Yes. In some places, yes, and in some places, no, but thinking about the local customs and what's acceptable. And sometimes the age of the numerator might matter as well, right? Can you?
But it can also, to recruit female enumerators, it can be really important to think about, right, mobility constraints, concerns around safety, norms around nights, staying nights outside of their household, right? So in Indonesia, we had a number of female enumerators, but there were very few that had any sort of training. So it took quite a bit of time. And we hadn't planned for that. We assumed that everybody was going to have quite a bit of experience. Absolutely. So it also, I mean, you have to really think through those things.
There's two different pressures. One is to collect information, kind of the citizen science approach, right? Where you're getting it kind of from the ground up, and really embedded in the local community. And that's can be really useful. It does mean that some of the kinds of things in the ways that it's less standardized, right? It's harder to get all those things I mentioned at the beginning about that you want to have standardized to be able to compare the data across communities is harder to do when you're doing citizen science. You've got to really train the people in a way that they can collect that data. It can be hard to do. So there's some trade-offs between them. Part of it means what you can do when you go to analyze the data, right? It's the citizen science data ends up being a little bit less kind of rigorous quantitative, and has a bit more of a qualitative feel to it, even if it's mostly quantitative data.
Yeah, so this is what I did for a couple of the surveys. I had a household level questionnaire to begin with, and then was able to choose based off of the household roster who's the two most appropriate individuals to interview. And then we had two enumerators who interviewed these two individuals separately and privately. So privately as possible, which meant sometimes going outside. One was outside of the house and one was inside the house, and it worked quite well, so to do it simultaneously with the couple, and to keep it fairly private.
And you could do the same thing with an adult and a teenager.
And a teenager, right? I think.
Which would be really interesting. The trick is you've got to have them both home at the same time, willing to be interviewed. So you've got to set that up probably in advance and make the arrangements that they're both going to be there. But it's better if you're doing multiple people from the same household, if you can, to interview them at the same time, so that you don't interview one and then have them have a conversation with each other about what the right answers are and how they're supposed to say it. So better to do them separately at the same time.
Thank you so much again, Cheryl and Maria. It's been a great session.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you.